of the European, non-European divide reconfigures all of the other global power structures. In other words, it sets out how the idea of race and racism becomes the organizing principle that structures all of the multiple hierarchies of the world system. Race and racism. Put another way, critical pedagogy argues that the different forms of labor in the global accumulation of capital are assigned according to this racial hierarchy. So that we're very sympathetic to Ramon Gros-Fuguel, who argues that, contrary to the Eurocentric perspective, race, gender, sexuality, spirituality, and epistemology are not additive elements to the economic and political structures of capitalist world system, but an integral, entangled, and constitutive part of the broad entangled package called the European modern colonial capitalist patriarchal world system. Our pedagogy underscores the importance of an anti-racism that at the same time constitutes a radical challenge to an economic system that's based on exchange, value, profit, and the rule of market. This is what we must oppose. The current dominant approach adopted by Western governments and many transnational NGOs for peace operations is a modernist approach that actually acts as an insuperable barrier to entering into the revolutionary environment. A critical pedagogy approach will better enable peacemakers to understand the motivations behind and missions of revolutionary actions. I close with Mahmoud Abul-Hamina, who provides a perfect example of this orientation. The soul, he said, the soul of religion, that's what's missing. Without it, Abu Halima said, Western prosecutors, journalists, and scholars like myself will never understand who I am. He said that he understood the secular West because he's lived like a Westerner in Germany and in the United States. The 17 years he'd lived in the West, Abu Halima told me, is a fair amount of time to understand what the hell is going on in the United States and in Europe about secularism or people, you know, who have no religion. He went on to say, I've lived their life, but they didn't live my life, so they will never understand the way I live or the way I think. Creating spaces for critical learning is difficult, since building reciprocal feelings of trust is paramount. Many students in university settings that I work in are reluctant to stay in classrooms where they feel they're going to be the objects of attack and derision. The goal, of course, is to challenge the experience of students without taking away their voices. You don't want to affirm a racist or sexist or homophobic voice, but how is such a challenge accomplished without removing the student's voice entirely? So that I try to learn from my own experiences working with university groups that define themselves as progressive, as radical. And I think that's a challenge that we have to take into the 21st century. I'm going to stop here because I want to leave time for dialogue, and I've got a lot more to say. Just give me some constant time out so that I'll be able to answer a lot of questions, so I won't be too long-winded in my answers. Thank you very much.
How would you explain the European and the non-European racism?
Let me give you an example, just some examples from my own personal history, if I could, very briefly. I remember being in Brazil, maybe 10 or 15 years ago, spending time in Porto Alegre, which is in the south, which is a very Europeanized city in Brazil, right? Unlike Bahia, or, Salvador Bahia, which is African Brazilian, right? And I remember I was addressing, I think it was about a group of 1,000 people. And it was a large auditorium, and I was talking about racism. And I was talking about racism in Brazil, and someone from the audience said, what right have you, as somebody coming from Estados Unidos, the United States, talking about racism in this country? We'd have no racism in this country. Because we idolize the mulata. sort of a European and African, like Spanish and African, Italian and African, European and African, a mixture, ethnic mixture. And I said, well, that's very interesting. I hope the term mulatto, and I really don't know, even to this day. I said, I hope it doesn't, the root isn't mule, which is a cross between a horse and a donkey, which is born sterile. I said that, why have I been in the houses of so many white Brazilians, and the only people with dark skin I see are cooking their food or sweeping their floors? Now, it was interesting. As soon as I looked in the audience, and this was in Santa Maria, and there were only 2 or 3 people I could see that I would get a sense were African Brazilians. And the rest looked very light-skinned and European. And as soon as I said that, a woman in a very dark-skinned woman, African Brazilian woman in a maid's outfit with high heels, came out to pour me a glass of water. Now that became a visual metaphor for exactly what I had said. I didn't need to say anything more. And the students swept me off the stage and took me to Umbanda, an Umbanda priest, a Pai de Santo. They were so, like, just, wow, that was a visual metaphor. But also, it's like in Mexico, I spent a lot of time. There's a group in Mexico that started a Critical Pedagogy Foundation that have honored me with visits. And I keep saying, I see more, blonde European-looking women in Mexican television than I do anywhere else. So there is this sense, I think, of a kind of a culture of coloniality, in which very often the kind of the casualties of colonialism percolate through countries today. In Venezuela, this is not entirely the case, but if you look at the opposition to Hugo Chavez, they're very racist in Venezuela, the light-skinned European Venezuelans. The things they call Hugo Chavez, who has, indigenous and African, blood, the things they call him, I wouldn't dare repeat here. And the people who live in the most dire poverty are the dark-skinned African, or indigenous Venezuelans. And so I was simply trying to make that point, that one has to understand that this sort of matrix, this racial hierarchy is not just some kind of additive to global capitalism, but it's a constitutive part of capitalism and the culture of coloniality. As a Marxist humanist, one of the first questions that we ask is, why have so many revolutions turned into their opposite? And that's a question we need to face, and that's why Marxist humanists like myself get attacked a great deal by all kinds of other Marxist groups, because we ask that question. It's the first question we raise. And I think that Hugo Chavez is, I serve on a think tank in Caracas with the Chavez regime. And one of the things that I think many of us have learned over the years is the failure of so-called, socialist states has been the failure of democracy. It was always thought that somehow you change the social relations of production, and once those social relations were altered, that somehow, democracy would either not be needed, would be outmoded with the fall of the state. But I think that these are mistakes, of course, we recognize. Direct democracy, participatory democracy is one of the keys, and I know certainly it's one of the keys of the Chavez regime, is to develop ways to foster direct participatory democracy, and that's not easy.